You mentioned a term earlier, entheogenesis, and I know in your bio there's a term in there, entheogen, and I had never heard of this before. What is an entheogen, and how, if at all, is it different to a psychedelic?
They are really one and the same. In many respects, initially when I entered this space, I liked the term entheogen because it had less stigma attached to it. Why most people don't, like yourself, didn't know what it was. So it didn't have the stigma that psychedelics have attached to it. Essentially, an entheogen is something that provides a spiritual experience from within, en like endogenous and theos, theological. So it's creating this spiritual and mystical state from within, which is one of the key aspects of a psychedelic experience. It creates mystical experiences which have been correlated with outcomes in treatment. So people who have a stronger mystical experience are more likely to get better. So there's clearly something going on there. But over the years, I think I've come back to embracing the term psychedelic and trying to reclaim it as a term to challenge that pre-existing stigma that's attached from the 60s and 70s. And so, when we set up Psychedelic Research and Science in Medicine, a not-for-profit company, is essentially established to get psychedelic research happening in Australia. We set that up in, I think, 2010, 2011, so it's quite some time ago, well before any research was happening. We thought it was best as a group to really reclaim the term and put psychedelic in our name, and I'm really glad that we did that now, because it does seem like the tide has turned and all of a sudden there's less stigma associated with psychedelics. Probably the opposite now. There's probably too much hype associated with them as potential treatments, and they're being professed to solve everything from homelessness through to traumatic brain injury. So there's a lot of hype out there at the moment, which is a completely separate issue than the stigma itself.
So that stigma that you speak to, and perhaps we can step back to the 1960s and have a quick chat about where some of that stems from. I think that was something you touched on. I would listen to one of your TEDx talks, and I got a sense that you were frustrated by the stigma, which was perhaps getting in the way of research and funding for research and approval from ethics, right, to conduct studies. That was 2017. I think a year ago I had Professor Susan Rossell on from Swinburne, and we talked a little bit about MDMA and psilocybin and some of the new research that had been published and changes with the TGA scheduling of these drugs. Have you been happy with the progress of psychedelic science in Australia since 2017 when that TEDx talk went up?
Yeah, absolutely. The tide turned right at 2017. We reconvened in December 2017 at another Entheogenesis Australis conference, and had many of the people in the room who were in the room when we first established Prism. We also had Ben Sessa from the UK, a well-known MDMA researcher. I won't list all of the people that were in the room, but essentially, one more, Rick Doblin was in the room. And essentially, we were sort of feeding back that we've been trying this for the last 7 years. We're pushing shit up a hill with a stick. We're not getting anywhere. And Rick Doblin was quite forthcoming and direct. He said, I established MAPS in 1986, and it took me 20 years to get the first clinical trial up and running. So what, you've been going for 7 years? Not his words, my words. Drink some concrete and harden up. But we also came up with some different ideas of how we could, different approaches we might not have thought of, and consequently, two things came from that. One was the St Vincent's psilocybin study, which has now been completed, looking at people with a terminal illness and providing sort of existential relief from their suffering, and also the MDMA trial that I'm overseeing here at Edith Cowan University, with the support of Prism and community donations that have come from Prism. That was essentially the start of psychedelic science in Australia. Pretty much 2018 onwards saw the start of psychedelic science in Australia, and it's really burgeoned since then with folks like Susan Rossell, Paul Lanatsky, running the Monash Lab, and other groups coming onto the scene. And I think we've got a very mature and a thriving psychedelic science community at the moment. Then things really changed in a dramatic way, again, sort of progressively, I guess, last year in February, and the TGA announced that they were going to reclassify MDMA and psilocybin as a Schedule 8 medicine for the treatment of PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, which makes us the first country in the world to recognise these drugs legislatively as medicines, in our medicines legislation, which is huge. But given that, as you were saying, 2017, nothing was happening in Australia. We don't have the experience that other countries have had. The US was doing research with psilocybin again back in 2006. MAPS have run 6 phase 2 clinical trials, 2 phase 3 clinical trials. There are so many therapists in the US who have been trained to do this, so that if this were to happen in the US, which it probably will this year, the FDA is likely to approve MDMA as a medicine. They're ready to hit the ground running. Australia was not ready to hit the ground running, and consequently, the legislative change came into effect on the 1st of July last year, and there's been recent media in the last week or two about the first person that's been treated under this scheme. So it's taken a long time for everything to come together. And the reason for that is we don't have the experience. We don't have training programs in place. We don't have the governance set up around how to manage this clinically out there in the community, which is very different to doing it in a clinical trial. And ultimately, I think the TGA was smart in their approach, in that they've made it very restrictive. It's hard for a psychiatrist to become an authorized prescriber. They have to first identify a patient, then develop a treatment protocol for that patient based on the literature and what's happening in clinical trials, get that approved by a Human Research Ethics Committee in Australia. So that in itself, that's a huge undertaking for a psychiatrist, who may not have research experience, which you need to be able to do this. And then you apply to the TGA to become an authorised prescriber, and then you have to figure out how to actually import or access the drugs. They're not these are not widely available pharmaceuticals in Australia at the moment. So there's a lot of barriers in place, but I actually think that's not such a bad thing, because we're not ready to hit the ground running and have this being prescribed at psychiatric offices around Australia. And ultimately, while I get that a lot of the excitement here is these are new promising treatments that could be effective, it doesn't overcome the problem we were talking about earlier with a 6 to 12 month wait list to be able to see somebody in the first place. So it's not fixing the problem, it's just putting another band-aid over here. And consequently, because there's been so much media hype around this, I'm genuinely concerned, given the cost at the moment of these potential treatments. So upwards of $25,000 per patient for one treatment, which is way out of reach for most Australians, particularly those with a mental health condition, that desperate people are going to do desperate things. And the more people in the community hear about this and realise that they can't access it because they can't afford it, or they can't access it because there's just simply not a clinic in their state yet, I worry that those folks will access these drugs illicitly, perhaps engage with underground shaman, underground healers that are operating all around Australia. And some of them are good quality people. They're doing quality control. I recently heard that one of the patients I had excluded from our MDMA trial went out to seek psilocybin in the underground and was excluded by the practitioner. So clearly they were doing some quality control, but it's Russian roulette. There are some very problematic practitioners out there as well, and there's been reports of sexual abuse and all kinds of things happening there. So from a harm reduction perspective, It's not a great idea to fill people full of hope, then tell them that they can't access these things, because they will go out and find other ways to access them. Desperate people will do desperate things.
Yeah, well, it seems you kind of need people working at both ends. What the science, looking at new tools that can be effective, and then at the level of accessibility in order to kind of to get these things out to the community and be used in the right context.